soil faster than you're replenishing it. So part of what we're doing with this is trying to keep our soils in place. And when you have erosion, the best of it goes down to the creek. And of course that has big impacts down further too. So everybody's got different goals, we all farm different, but we really believe in the no-till cover crop system because it helps prevent erosion. And if you think back to history, when our grandparents were farming, they were plowing these hills up and down the hill, and they had lots of erosion, and their light went on one day too, and we said, we got to do it different, we got to go around on the contour. Those things happened back in the 50s and 60s, and I'm sure it took more time, but sometimes we got to take more time to do it the right way. So with that, kick things in gear.
So I want to make sure everybody knows who the board members are, so if you have ideas, you can go to them. So we have Jake Catterley, Brian Feller, could you stand up, please? Thank you. Dennis Miller in the back. Is Nick here?
There's Nick.
Nick. Okay, Nick doesn't have to stand. Alvin? Is Alvin coming yet? Nope, Alvin Francis, if anybody knows him. Bob Zerflu. I'm sure he'll be here later. Jeremy Lucky. We have Nelma Judah. And so those are the board members that we have right now that are helping put together speakers, field days, things like that. At the end of the day, there'll be an evaluation. If you guys have any ideas, we would love to hear them, because otherwise it's only our ideas rather than what you guys want to see and hear. So I did up this recap of what we did last year as a way for you guys to know. And so we had a lot of things that happened, of field days and tours and that. And all of the reference material and resources are online on the website. So if you go to greencountylwcd.com, Farmers of the Sugar River, plans and summaries, you'll have that. And there's all links, past years and things that you can look into. If you, we did, like our shop talk was on calibrating your drill. We've got links as to a video on how to do it and a paper resource as to if you'd rather read how to do it. So last year we had $26,142 to spend, and we spent most of it. Just a little over 100 is all we've carried over into this year. 73% of that money went straight back into farmers' pockets, or to help reduce costs for testing or other projects that they were doing. So the money we have this year is $13,000, so we were cut significantly. We've had some roundtables already this year. We're planning a summer field day. Haven't figured out a time or a place or a topic yet, so open to suggestions. And in August, I think is what we're looking at, we're going to have a combine cleaning clinic to kind of think about spreading weed seeds. We should be cleaning our combines so that we're not spreading those weed seeds everywhere.
We'll do that down at Johnson Tractor. They got to combine it in with their combine clinic. Can everybody hear me? So when we do that shop talk, we're going to do that down at Johnson Tractor and combine it in with their combine clinic. So you'll get some combine maintenance along with how to clean that machine out. Brian did one, how long ago?
10 years ago.
10 years ago?
I think it was.
Gee, time goes fast. But to really clean one out, if you want to get those water hemp seeds, that's probably the weed that everybody's really concerned about, and they're little bitty pebbles, they stick everywhere. There's a bunch of things you can go through to get them out of there if you get a field that's really nasty. So.
Okay. Any questions?
And if you haven't signed up for the emails, there's a sign-up sheet back there, and Tanya will inundate your email with lots of stuff all the time, so you got plenty of things to read.
And also, if you're a CCA, I did apply for CCA credits, and so back there's a QR code you can scan, or if you want to just write your name, I'll scan it and send it back into powers that be. Okay, with no further ado. So a Neonic forum was held last October in Madison. Presenters were agency folks like DNR and DACAP, scientists, attorneys, and even the EPA. It was a well-planned and thorough event. It was recorded and it's available online, so just search for Neonic Forum. I know that people's understanding of neonicotinoid issues are all over the board, but I see it as a piece of our soil health that is overlooked. So please keep an open mind to new information presented here today and be respectful to each other. And so first off, we're going to start with kind of background information. And we have Mike Miller with the DNR. He's a stream ecologist, and he is going to give us more information on what these neonicotinoids are and why we might be concerned about them. So Mike, please.
Very good. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity. When Tanya first approached me about coming to speak to this group, admittedly I was pretty apprehensive and very curious to see how this plays out. I just learned last week that, as I understand it now, there's upwards of like 50 different farmer-led water quality groups in the state. That's tremendous. Frankly, I've worked on watershed management projects for decades now, and whether it's through NRCS or DNR or whatever, and frankly, in my opinion, they've not been particularly effective. So frankly, you folks have been pulled into this discussion decades ago. So again, I'm very happy to have this opportunity, and hope we can chat afterwards. So without any further ado, I'll kind of get into my presentation here. Let's see. So I felt like coming down here. I live in Madison, work for the DNR. Perhaps with some of you already have like 2 strikes against me. So for what it's worth, I grew up on a family farm in Sheboygan County. So my tattered photograph of my pet rooster George. So anyways, that fall my dad said, Mike, we're going to move that chicken to this other farmer's property for the winter. I didn't quite understand what that was all about. But then curiously enough, that Sunday my mom made roast chicken. So coincidence? Maybe. So I think I know a little bit about your work. Again, having grown up on a family farm. So again, with that, I'm going to kind of share my work, my world as far as in aquatic resources. Again, I work for the DNR. I'm a monitoring expert. I spend my time looking at the quality of our streams and rivers primarily in the state and the effects of land use on water quality. So that's going to be the focus of my presentation for the next 50 minutes or so. And Tanya, if I start going long, if you give me like a 5-minute warning so I can wrap up, so don't go long. So, Wisconsin is a very water-rich state. We got, depending what you call a pond or a lake, we got 15,000 lakes, got 5 million acres of wetlands. Again, as you can read here, we got 42,000 miles of streams and rivers in the state. And those are perennial streams, those that flow year-round. If we talk about the ones that dry up because of perhaps poor land use or just naturally, you could double that number to roughly about 84,000 miles, a very water-rich state. We took all those streams and rivers and straightened them out and lined them up end to end, and we could encompass planet Earth 1.6 times. So lots and lots of water in the state. So this neonicotinoids doesn't really exactly roll off one's tongue, but I'm going to again focus on what I know about neonics and kind of their impacts on the environment. What you're seeing in this slide is not kind of dark slide, but you're seeing some mayflies hatching up on the Mississippi River. And I'm going to go into detail later on the importance of aquatic insects and what they mean for our environment. Again, kind of dark slide, perhaps you can't see this, but certainly when I was growing up and much later, egg producers, farmers, truck drivers, whatever, put screening material on the front of the radiators to prevent their radiators from becoming plugged up with insects. I'm not certain your more local experience or recent experiences now, but I certainly don't see this happening anymore. The density and diversity of insects have dropped off dramatically. We've got a lot of kind of anecdotal data or evidence that these insect numbers are declining, but we don't frankly have very good monitoring data to back that up. There's some global studies, but the point is, we've got pretty weak information in this state, and again, primarily based on personal observations, mine and hundreds of others across the state. So there's three things I wanted to touch on in this morning's presentation. I want to make the case for the importance of insects. Two, I'll get into the details, I think, what I've been asked to talk about again. What are these neonics and what are the impacts on the environment? And lastly, as a person that monitors streams and rivers across the state, I can share with you some data that I collected over the last few years on what we're finding in our streams and rivers as far as pesticides and other chemicals. So I want to state up front that I certainly recognize, you got to believe the DNR as a whole recognizes that pesticides are fundamentally important to crop production. So don't think that I'm from the DNR, and so any chemical use is bad. Again, this is kind of my opening statement here, that I recognize they're important, but I'd also offer that if we don't apply them intelligently or use the wrong ones, whatever, they can create a fair amount of environmental harm. So again, my overview here. So what's the problem with these declines in aquatic insects or terrestrial insects? I asked one of the people in this group before I put together my presentation, I said, I've never really spoke to these groups before. How can I best relate to them? He said, Miller, whatever you do, don't show tables and plots and a bunch of data. So I apparently ignored part of his guidance, but I'll have just one or two plots of data. So to kind of bear with me, and I'll kind of get beyond this. But again, as a scientist, I'm very familiar with the literature. There's been a number of studies, primarily, frankly, from Europe, that have been doing a better job of tracking kind of some of these environmental changes. And so again, there's some papers that came out back in 2017 and later showing major declines in insects. And again, we kind of have weak data in the U.S., but we have similar evidence here. So again, this will be like hopefully the last plot I show you. For those in the back that can't read the scales, it's not important. Just look at those lines. They're trending down over time. Those are various studies looking at insects, whether they're aquatic insects, terrestrial insects. So again, pretty compelling evidence across the globe. So this is what insect diversity looks like. Again, entomologists, people that study insects for a living, what they've done for 100 years is they take bed sheets and hang them up at night, either with a gas lantern or electric lamp, would light up the sheet and that'd attract insects at night. And then depending on their studies, they'd collect all the insects and look for the ones that they're studying in particular, that sort of thing. So an insect light trap, this is what aquatic insect or terrestrial insect diversity looks like. That past slide was from 2007. You can see this time series from 12 years later. Same study site, same time of year, same lights used. So this is what loss of insects looks like on the landscape. So why these declines? Kind of the usual suspects, habitat loss, now climate change, and then lastly, the use of some of these agrochemicals. So what good are insects? Again, they're pests to our crops, or pests to livestock. You got ticks and fleas and mosquitoes and horseflies, the list goes on. But again, they're fundamentally important. I can't stress this enough, and I probably won't do a great job of making the case for them. But again, they're the base of our food chains. If we lose these animals, say goodbye to many other parts of our ecosystems. Again, this idea back, perhaps you remember from your 6th grade biology class, you learned that plants are these primary producers. Sunlight falls on them, they produce vegetation, and then we have these primary consumers like insects that feed on that vegetation, and so on and so forth up the food chain. So if we lose that key link in the food chain, that's going to have real dramatic effects in other parts of the environment. They're also pollinators. When I talk about pollinators, I think the image that popped into your minds right now are honeybees or other types of bees, and they're certainly important pollinators. There's been some studies showing that these pollinators represent billions of dollars in economic activity as far as pollinating certain crops. I realize that corn and soybeans are wind pollinated, so it's not an issue with you folks for these common crops, but they're fundamentally important for many other crops. And also they're population control agents. Certain animal populations kind of get out of whack, and that includes humans as well. They can cause disease in those populations and reduce their number. And so they had a strong controlling effect, whether good or bad, on the environment. They're janitors. If you ever kicked over a raccoon carcass that was sitting on the side of the road, you'll see it covered with maggots and beetles and that sort of thing. So they break down a lot of the animal tissue that ends up dead on the landscape. And also very important for amending soil. They create pathways for water when they burrow down from the surface into the soil horizon. So that's a pathway for water and nutrients. So again, they're very important as far as amending the soils and improving soil structure. The list goes on. So I don't think I've made a very compelling argument with you folks today, but rest assured they're fundamentally important, and we can't afford to lose them. So now I want to touch on what neonics are, and I think that's kind of the focus of what you want to hear about. So just to help you with the terminology here. So again, neonics doesn't necessarily roll off your tongue very easily, or neonicotinoids. So I'll just use neonics for the rest of my presentation. As you can read here, and you can see in this picture, we've got a aphids feeding on a plant leaf. Again, they are sap feeders, so they drain the sap and reduce the vigor, if not kill the plant. So again, for a number of different plant species, they evolved to create nicotine to kill those pests. Now, when humans ingest nicotine, you smoke a cigarette, cigar, chew some tobacco, you get nervous stimulation. When insects are exposed to nicotine, it means paralysis and death. So nicotine is extremely toxic to insect species in particular. Not to get too down in the weeds on how they affect animals, but as you can read here, they're neurotoxins. They affect how we communicate with our bodies. You can read here, they're advertised that neonics are much more toxic than insects than other animal species, whether it's birds or mammals, that sort of thing, and that's very true. But again, there's been some benefits to using these different chemicals relative to things like DDT. You perhaps remember that for those older people in the audience, that DDT was responsible for the decline of many different bird species because they accumulate in the bodies of animals, and that gets transmitted up the food chain. Neonics are a little bit different, so again, they're kind of sold as this better product. In my opinion, that's open to debate. Again, they're broad spectrum pesticides. So again, when the chemical companies, when Bayer and Shell developed neonics in the 1970s, they did a great job. They developed a chemical that's extremely toxic to insect pests, but the downside is they're also equally toxic to non-pest species. So they're broad spectrum, they're non-discriminating. Again, it'll kill a beneficial butterfly or honeybee just as quickly as it does that corn, some grub or other insect pest. Again, there's an increasing number of studies. Again, as a scientist, this is what I do. I keep up on the journal articles. There's hundreds of different studies across the planet showing detriments of the use of these chemicals, the neonics. And a key issue in all this is that the primary use of neonics is on seed-applied applications. So whether it's corn or soybean or wheat, again, applying to the seeds, you plant the seeds. It's thought that kind of takes care of your insect pest issues. So again, by far, as you can read here, upwards of 90% of neonic use in the United States and frankly globally is a seed-applied chemical. But as you also probably know that they're used as foliar sprays. There's a granulated forms that they'll spread out on ball diamonds or golf courses, other turf management activities. Root drenches, they've got problems with emerald ash borers in our urban areas. They'll inject neonics into the root ball, and that gets transmitted up into the tree. They actually inject it directly into the tree itself. Baits, so in urban areas in particular, they apply neonics to sugar or other types of baits to attract ants and cockroaches, so they're applied fairly heavily in urban areas as well. And topical applications, whether it's on livestock or your pets, when you're using flea collars or drops that you put on your pets, those are often a source for an application of neonics. So in this state, we have 500 different compounds that are registered by the Department of Agriculture that contain neonicotinoids in them. So a number of different products are used. So I'm going to walk you through a time series of neonic use in the United States. So imidacloprid is just one of 3 primary and 5 total Neonicotinoid products are most routinely used in the United States for agricultural production as far as corn and soybean. So again, imidacloprid is one of these 3 major chemicals. So these chemicals first became commercially available in 1993. So I'm going to walk you through this time series. So again, the dark coloration shows higher application rates of neonics. So starting in 1995 on to 2000, 2005, 2010, 2015. I think I'm seeing a trend here. Maybe, all right. So what about after 2015? Actually, we have no data, little or no data on the use of neonics after 2015. So why is that? So the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, they're responsible for managing pesticide usage in the United States. There's a rule called a treated article clause that back in roughly, well, in the early 2000s, folks like lumber producers or vendors that would, you talk about green lumber that is injected with fungicides and other chemicals. They're concerned that when they sold their lumber, would that be viewed as selling pesticides? So there's this clause that said, well, no, if you apply these chemicals to certain products, we won't consider that an insecticide. Well, unfortunately, the chemical companies have taken advantage of what I call a loophole, where now when they apply chemicals to seeds like neonics, it's no longer considered a pesticide. So again, I've worked in this area for a long time. If there's ever evidence that, frankly, the Environmental Protection Agency is kind of lacking in control of some of these environmental concerns, this is a kind of prime example for me where, again, these are insecticides, just that, again, the attorneys have sought loopholes in this law, and so now we no longer track with any great detail the chemical producers and vendors don't have to report as much information on the use of these chemicals, even though they're as toxic as they were 5 years before this clause was taken into effect. So again, this is a big business. So again, I've been kind of bashing the EPA here a little bit, but their office in Washington, D.C. and their regional offices are pretty darn small. And so when big businesses come in with armies of attorneys and public relations firms, that sort of thing, they kind of struggle to kind of keep their heads above water on some of these issues. So I don't necessarily blame the EPA to a large extent here. So again, little or no data on the use of these chemicals since 2015. So based on literature, at least from what I've read, that nearly 100% of all seed corn you folks purchase are pre-treated with neonics. So even if you did not want to use these chemicals, you have little choice in the matter. And the same holds true to a large extent with soybeans, where again, upwards of 60-65% of the soybean seeds that you folks can purchase are again pre-treated. So again, even if you want to not use the chemicals, you may not have a choice. And I think, and again, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, and women, after my presentation, as far as I kind of see this as, you folks see this as kind of an insurance policy, where you got lots of things to struggle with on the farm and plenty of things to worry about. So, okay, I'll buy these treated seeds, I'll plant them, they'll reduce the risk of me getting some kind of pest outbreak. So that's one less thing I have to worry about when I'm trying to make it grow things in the summertime. So, I kind of can appreciate that mindset to some extent. So it's kind of seen as an insurance policy where, yeah, I'll buy these chemicals, they're not particularly expensive, and I can sleep better at night knowing that I'm not going to see some outbreak in my corn or soybean, that sort of thing, or wheat. So you guys can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but for a few decades, there's a big push for integrated pest management, and here are some of the kind of primary thoughts on that, where, again, you rotate your crops to reduce pests build up in the field, so rotated from corn to soy. And I realize there's less dairy rotation these days, but again, if you have continuous corn, not surprisingly, there's a higher likelihood you're going to have a buildup of corn pests in those crop fields. Again, this idea of monitoring for pests, don't apply these chemicals unless you see there's an obvious outbreak in your fields. And then lastly, again, treat only when necessary. So again, I'm not a producer here, so you might have a different perspective on this, but that's kind of my understanding. So I think when you folks are applying liquid pesticides in the fields, you buy some volume and you dilute it in the water, that sort of thing. So I think you have a pretty solid, very accurate understanding of what you're applying to your crop field. But the situation, I believe, is different when you're buying pre-treated seeds. There's been some interesting studies done by the University of Wisconsin-Madison and elsewhere, where you can read here as well as I can, that over 100 different chemicals are applied to these seeds. Again, upwards of 40 different active ingredients. And so anyways, there was some surveys done of ag producers asking them, do you folks have an understanding of what's on your seeds? And frankly, I don't think you folks necessarily have the time or interest to delve into the details of what's being applied to the seeds. There's a fair amount of kind of unknowns out there as far as the chemicals you guys are using when you plant these seeds. So this is kind of a placeholder slide for me to just remember to mention this. So the DNR has a number of different properties where farmers plant crops on those state properties until they get switched over to some wildlife area or whatever. So the point is, there's now a rule in effect where if you're planting on these state lands, you have to use non-treated seeds. So the point is, I've been hearing for years now that you can't buy untreated seeds, at least for corn and to some extent with soybeans. But as I now understand, talking to a few DNR staffers, there are seed vendors out there that if you get a hold of them, contact them, frankly, this time of year for next year's orders, you can get untreated seeds. So, if that's something you folks want to consider, there is that option out there. And I just heard about this, frankly, earlier this week, so I need to kind of delve into this in a little more detail, but I'll certainly share this information with Tanya and others that, again, if it's something you're concerned about and you want to use untreated seeds as far as neonics are concerned, we do have options. So some properties of neonics that I think you folks should be aware of. One, they're water soluble. So the strategy is with the use of seed applied neonics is, again, they're applied to the exterior of the seed itself, and then when they germinate, again, these chemicals are water soluble and they'll start being taken up by the plant. Again, they get distributed throughout the root system, the stem, leaves, and eventually the fruit. So again, a systemic pesticide or insecticide that can protect against these different pests of different life stages or parts of the crop plant. But the fact that they're water soluble also means that they move very well in the environment. So if they move off the crop field, they can very quickly get distributed into surface waters or groundwater. They're long-lived. Again, there's been a number of studies showing that these chemicals, depending on the environment, they can last after application upwards of 7 years. So we see buildups in crop fields, and after people stop applying these chemicals, there's a lag time before these chemicals kind of degrade out of the system. So they're fairly long-lived. A key finding here, and again, kind of every one of my statements, I had some personal opinions I threw out there, and I'll have a few more yet today, but for any of these, what I consider facts being thrown out here, I'm offering citations. Not that any of you are going to bother to look those up, but if you have questions, Miller, where did you come up with that number? I'd be more than happy to kind of back that up with scientific literature. But a key finding here is that, again, 90% of the neonics are not taken up by the crop plant. So where they end up, of course, they end up in the soil, and much of that evidently or eventually into the aquatic resources. So what are the risks of these chemicals to the environment? So a little fun fact, sugar granules worth of neonic. So this much neonic, as you can read here, is enough to kill 125,000 honeybees. One granule, 125,000 honeybees. We apply tons of neonics on our landscape in the state and the upper Midwest, and we're not tracking them. So to continue with that painful analogy, again, those little sugar packets that you dump in your tea or coffee in the morning, they roughly hold around 3 or 4 grams of sugar. Again, a comparable amount of neonicotinoids is enough to kill 600 million honeybees. And again, it's not just bees, it's ants. Again, it's a broad spectrum chemical that affects a lot of different invertebrate life. So we do studies looking at insect diversity. We compare some kind of more wild areas, like a prairie or tallgrass prairie in this example, in our crop fields. Again, we tend to see much less animal and insect diversity in our crop fields relative to kind of more wild lands. And of course, as producers, you see that as a benefit. You don't want a bunch of certainly pest bees up in the field, damaging your crops. So I get that. But again, recognize Again, if a fourth of Wisconsin's landscape now is in agricultural production, frankly, we've kind of simplified the environment in much of Wisconsin, the Midwest, and frankly, the globe for that matter. So as far as, how important are these animals, how numerous are they, that sort of thing. So scientists have cataloged roughly 1.2 million animal species on planet Earth. And over a million of those are insect species. So the point is, the planet is dominated by insects. And lastly, it's thought that, frankly, we don't even really know how many animals are on planet Earth. This is just what we've identified so far. No doubt you folks in the newspaper or on radio, whatever occasion hear that a new species of animal was found. But kind of on the other side of that equation is that we're losing thousands of different animals and we have no clue what's happening because frankly we don't know they're out there. How important are they? That's open to debate. So again, when we do lose animal species, and just one example here, we've got certain animals that are high profile, and we lose them, we kind of wring our hands for a couple days after we hear the news report, and then kind of go on with our lives. And so again, it's kind of a sad thing in my opinion. But again, the point I'm trying to make here is we're losing lots of different animals, primarily insects, on the landscape, and we have no idea that they're even out there. So why should we care? Well, there's good evidence that we should be more concerned. So I didn't want to get too much into the weeds as far as biology or ecology or science or whatever, but E.O. Wilson, he was an ecologist at Harvard University. Unfortunately, died about 5 years ago. He was the world's authority on ants. He wrote books on ants, world authorities. So what? But again, I want you folks to read this quote here because it resonates with me as far as when I studied the environment. Again, this little animal off to the right in that screen, it's actually an underwater photograph. That's called a net-spinning caddisfly. Big deal. They're about so big, you got a scientific name about this big, they're kind of drab little fellows. Who cares about these crummy little caddisflies? Well, when I study streams, I see that these animals represent about a third of the animal weight or biomass in the stream. So if we lose those crummy little caddisflies, say goodbye to 30% of the creek chubs, 30% of the brown trout, 30% of the kingfishers, the list goes on and on up the food chain. So those little animals are fundamentally important. So up until about a week and a half ago, we didn't get much snow in Madison, and I think that probably held true for Albany in this area, Greene County, whatever. Actually, I took this photograph in June. So what you saw on that last slide was that emergence of mayflies on the Mississippi River, and so that's what that looks like. Watch this clip for a minute while I drink. So presumably you recognize the counties in the western Wisconsin, Vernon, Richland, etc. And I see this is Minnesota counties, and what we have here is this dividing line of the Mississippi River. So what we're seeing here on Doppler radar is the emergence of mayflies off the Mississippi River. They spend most of their life as an immature stage in the sediments of the rivers and many of our lakes. And then at certain times of the year, late June into July, they emerge as winged adults. So Stupani and others took advantage of using this technology of using Doppler radar, and they estimated that in just one single emergence, and these occur multiple times over the course of the summer, upwards of 20 billion of these mayflies emerge in one night, and they're about so big, and so they represent a pretty important bit of food for lots of different animals. So again, upwards of 100 tons of mayflies leaving the Mississippi River just in one night. And then they've done some estimates of how much calories are in one of these, and multiply that by billions. Again, so a phenomenal amount of energy coming out of the river in just a few days. And they've estimated also that if all those insects, and they're not, of course, fed upon by birds, that would represent enough food for 25 million birds. And many birds, frankly, do take advantage of this food source, as do fish, frogs, turtles, snakes, and this goes on. So the point I'm trying to make here is, again, those nondescript mayflies, the hexagenia mayflies that probably 99% of you have never heard of before, are really key links in the food chain in many parts of the state. And it's not just these mayflies, but the other hundreds of different species of aquatic insects and terrestrial insects that are key links in the food chain. And kind of a disturbing fact, they've been tracking these emergences over this time frame, and we're seeing very dramatic declines in these mayflies. Is it solely attributed to insecticides? No. There's been changes in the water velocity in the Mississippi River. There's been increases of exotic species, invasive species like zebra mussels. So there's lots of different things going on in the Mississippi River, but pesticides are a likely cause of part of this issue. So I can't emphasize this enough again. Those little nondescript insects that you've never heard of before, don't particularly have time to think about, are fundamentally important to our food chains. And one of the reasons people start getting concerned about loss of aquatic insects, there's a lot of people that are fly fishers, trout anglers, and they spend, many of them, myself included, spend decades fishing the same rivers over time. We take little notes on, yeah, I was out on May 12th, and these mayflies are hatching, and it's a good hatch, and I had a good day fishing. So the point is, fly fishers in particular are kind of some of the first responders, or kind of eyes on the landscape as far as noting changes in the environment. And so there's certainly a fair amount of concern among certain people that spend a lot of time in these aquatic environments because they're seeing major changes in those insect populations. So I'm guessing prior to today, some good number of you had never heard of neonicotinoids, or maybe had some vague understanding, but hopefully the majority of you have at least heard about colony collapse in honeybees. They've kind of got a lot of attention in Europe and subsequently in the United States, where we're seeing major declines in honeybees, and those that keep apiaries, they're very concerned, and again, and they're key pollinators. That's all well and good, but again, that's just one insect species out of hundreds that perhaps we should be keeping track of. So I'm going to walk you through my anecdotal evidence of declines in insects. Again, I spent a lot of time over in the driftless area fly fishing. I come back through Viroqua, Wisconsin. They got a big quick trip. Again, over the years, I'd go to a mom and pop gas station at night, coming back from fishing to get something to drink or gas or whatever. Anyways, there'd be swarms of insects around the lights around those little gas stations. Now when I stop at my local quick trip, or actually the one in Viroqua, and look up at the lights, sometimes I'll see like one little moth kind of buzzing around. And I get it that LED lights are different than incandescent lights as far as attracting insects. But the point is, there's a fair amount of anecdotal evidence that we're seeing these major population declines. Another anecdotal evidence that I have is, again, when I go out trout fishing, there's some favorite spots I go to every year. You're going to get out there fairly early in the morning and still dew on the landscape. And again, all these, I suspect many of you have seen these orb spiders. They got a big body about so big and yellow and black, whatever, very distinct spiders. But anyway, the point is, when I walk through these meadow areas, I used to see hundreds of spider webs dotting the landscape, and now when I go back to those same sites, they're damn few. So again, not scientific, reproducible information, but just kind of anecdotal observations I've made over the years. So I work at the Department of Natural Resources, downtown Madison. The front of the building, actually, when I come to work, I come in the back door because I bicycle, but the point is, most of you know that there's a couple of big lakes in Madison, and it's on the isthmus, blah, blah, blah. But the point being is that the lights on the outside of the building at night attract lots of little insects called midges that hatch out of Lake Monona, which is a couple blocks away. So for years, when I'd come to work, I'd open up the back door, and there'd be a windrow of dead midges on the ground. They get attracted to the lights, they get dried out over the course of the night and fall dead in front of the doors. And there's literally, it'd be like this thick, and maybe a windrow maybe 4 inches wide along this 15, 20 foot wide entrance to the building. And now when I go into the building, if I see a handful of these midges, where again they used to be in piles, again, I just see these major declines in their population. Another weird observation, as somebody who's an entomologist and thinks about this stuff, but back in the bad old days when you'd go to the gas station, pull out the squeegee or sponge or whatever to wash your windshield, it had a horrible smell. Why is that? Well, the last 50 people that used that squeegee scrubbed off all the bugs off their windshield and put that sponge back in this thing of water, and so you had this nice rotting stew of dead bug parts cooking in the summer sun for X number of days or hours or whatever. Now, when I go to the gas station, I use that same squeegee. It's nice and minty fresh. There's no smell of rot, because there's damn few insects ending up in those wash basins. Recent study done at UW La Crosse. Again, these chemicals are described as being safe to vertebrate species, where this study they did at UW La Crosse, they dosed the eggs and fry of fathead minnows, a very common species in the state, and they found that they saw a reduction in hatching success of these fish, and also they had less of a startle response, where they literally just tap on the tank of these dosed fish, fatheads, and they wouldn't really respond to that type of stimulation. And that may seem, well, so what? Well, so what? That means they're less active, they're less likely to avoid predators, so that's probably not a good thing if you want to maintain a population. Again, I could spend the rest of the day citing different studies, but again, we see in our wetlands there's a decline in invertebrates, and that has implications for waterfowl, just as another example. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, as far as some of the vertebrate species, there's been tracking of birds across the U.S. for many years now, and it's thought that we've seen a reduction of about 1/4 of the overall population of birds in North America. And so that equates to about 3 billion individual birds. And again, there's certainly a number of different things going on. There's loss of habitat, predators like too many wild feral cats out on the landscape, but loss of the food chain, the insects, is fundamentally important. Upwards of 95% of all bird species, at least as part of their life, they rely on insects. Even a hummingbird will feed its young insects at certain times of the year. So if we lose those insects, say goodbye to other species that rely on them. Another interesting study done, well, actually it was noticed back in the 2000s that hunters received deformities in white-tailed deer in eastern Montana. And so that got folks at the University of South Dakota to do a study where they took captive deer and they dosed their water with neonics. And here's what some of the results they saw from their captive white-tailed deer study. So they saw lower weights of the animals. Some of the organs were starting to shrink. Thyroid dysfunction, whatever that means, and then lastly, they're seeing lower survival of the fawn. So, again, evidence that it's not just insects being impacted by these chemicals, but mammals as well. More deformities. And then the state of Minnesota did a follow-up study where they asked hunters, and I think this was last year or 2 years ago, to save the spleens from their deer that they had harvested, and they found higher levels of neonics in the spleens of these wild deer than actually the concentrations that were found in these test deer in South Dakota. So again, if we're seeing these types of problems in test deer at lower concentrations, what does that mean for wild animals that have higher concentrations? So this should have been, well, frankly, I could have saved you guys all like half hour and just showed this one slide. Sean Connolly is a researcher, an agronomist at UW-Madison. He should have been, I know Tanya invited him and he had a schedule conflict, but the kind of bottom line in all this discussion, I think to a large extent, is how useful are these chemicals as far as corn and soybean production. So again, I could have saved you all some time and just showed you this slide, or better yet, Sean Connolly should have been here, or better yet, you can invite Sean to a subsequent meeting, but he's an agronomist and a very sharp researcher, and he spends his whole career studying these issues of crop productivity and the influences of these various agrochemicals. So anyways, I'll show some information here. So again, this first study I'm reciting is from Cornell University, and I got this report on my desk. It's 400 pages. They did a shockingly thorough job in this study. Again, as a scientist, it's very important to publish your findings, and so it can be reviewed by other scientists to make certain that you're doing quality work. So again, peer-reviewed scientific information is fundamentally important for us to advance science. So what they found in this particular study, and you can read the pie charts as well as I can, but again, for hundreds and hundreds of field trials in multiple states, several Canadian provinces, as you can read here, for both corn and soybean, producers saw a little benefit in using seed-applied neonics. Again, they did these paired trials of trial plantings of corn that were with treated seeds and another trial planting with untreated seeds. So again, some pretty strong evidence that these chemicals are offering a little benefit as far as crop production or increased yields are concerned. Again, back to University of Wisconsin. And again, this particular study, not only were there these sharp researchers from UW-Madison, but again, 12 other universities across the U.S. where there's heavy soybean production. So these are, with the exception, I think, of one of these researchers, they were all agronomists. So they're not tree huggers, they're not bug lovers. They're folks that focus their careers on improving crop production. And again, so I don't think they have as strong a bias as I might have in discussing this issue. But the point is, and you folks can read as well as I can, for those of you in the back that maybe can't read this very well, but the bottom line is that they felt that they did not see a significant increase in crop yields when farmers are using these seed-applied neonics on soybeans. So we've got this massive study from Cornell University, extremely rigorous study from the University of Wisconsin, there's a dozen other top-flight universities. So in my mind, that's pretty significant evidence. So why might that be? So out of that same study at UW, they offered this graphic. So this pink colored wedge here is to represent the concentration of neonics in the crop seeds and subsequently the seedlings and so on and so forth as those plants develop. And so as they illustrate here, the quantity of neonics drop off very dramatically. So by the time, in this example, aphids are in good numbers in the crop fields, and that's illustrated by this bell-shaped curve. Again, by the time the aphids are in the soybean fields, those chemicals have leached out of the plants, so it's relatively ineffective. Again, what little is taken up by the plants to begin with, in roughly 5, maybe 10%, a small amount is kind of diluted out by plant growth, and then again, most of these chemicals are ending up in the ground and then subsequently our surface waters and groundwater. There's been some other interesting studies with gray slugs, if I get my facts straight, and then other studies showing that when some of these insecticides are used, they actually knock down the predators that are out in our crop fields. There's actually been evidence that we see outbreaks of pest species because of the loss of some of these natural predators. So it's we're kind of working against ourselves in some respect. So this is my back-of-the-envelope computation. We got some guys from BAS here that can certainly correct me. So I don't have a whole lot of confidence in my ballpark estimate. What I did was just look at kind of application rates per seed and did some quick computations. I think I've drawn a blank on what the numbers are, but we produce roughly about 3 million acres of field corn in the state each year, maybe 2.3 million acres of soybeans in this state. So based on those crude numbers, I wouldn't take this number to the bank by any means, but the point I want to make is ag producers are spending a fair amount of money on these chemicals. Again, on a $1 billion state agricultural industry, maybe that's a drop in the bucket, or perhaps when you look at it from working with razor-thin margins of profit, maybe this is a big number. I'll let you folks kind of wrestle with that one. And so who's benefiting from that? Well, I guess I shouldn't come here pointing fingers, but again, it's a very profitable business. And I'll offer here in these numbers, this is from an environmental group from Europe, this pesticide atlas, so it was not a peer-reviewed journal article, so you can take it for what it's worth. But it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, so I don't think these companies are going to throw up their hands and say, you know, Miller, you're right. You probably shouldn't be marketing these chemicals or using them in these certain applications. And again, also based on that study, kind of gray literature study, we call them, again, this thought that these 4 companies are really cornering the market on the production of these chemicals. And also I read last week, and I don't know, can't recall the source, but these same 4 companies also cornered about 52% of the seed market or production market in the U.S. So again, market forces are driving a lot of things that perhaps they shouldn't. So back to actually my world, and I can speak with a little more confidence. So back in 2022, I did this study of streams. I had a computer pick a bunch of random sites on the landscape. You see these orange dots in the middle. Again, it's a random sample, but I had the computer pick watersheds with a certain amount of ag production of certain types. So that area in the southern part of the state is vegetable crop production. So again, even though I did a statewide draw, there's very few watersheds in the state that have high densities of vegetable crop production. So whether that's snap peas or carrots or potatoes, whatever. And then also part of that draw was actually I should show this here. I looked for watersheds with high amount of urban development as far as light urban development. So that means green space, ballparks, water, parks, soccer diamonds, that sort of thing. So the point is, you see some clusters on the map, which is not good from a statistical perspective, but that's kind of how things played out. So anyways, here's some findings from this particular study. So at each one of these sites, we went out and grabbed water samples and sent them off to a couple of different laboratories for analysis for pesticides. One lab just looked at neonics, the other lab, the EPA lab, quantified 374 different pesticide compounds in the water as far as they looked for them. So again, you can read here, over 100 different pesticides are found in our surface waters across the state. Again, a mix of herbicides, fungicides, insecticides. Again, at any one site, the minimum number I found at any one site was 9 different pesticides. And I'm talking about the forested north, not just the ag production areas of Wisconsin, and upwards of 91 different compounds at one site. And then on average, at any one of these 100 random sites across the state, that's seeing, as you can read here, average of 28 different compounds. And again, a very relatively high frequency of occurrence of neonics in these water bodies. And again, this random sample should be reflective of our statewide stream and river population. And also part of that study, I kind of, not getting the weeds in the statistics, but I could weight each one of those sites. So again, streams in the state, it's like a tree where there's a lot of small little tributaries, fewer bigger branches, and one big trunk. So the point is, if I just did a random sample, I'd get a lot of data from a bunch of little twigs and not much from these bigger branches, but I use some statistics to kind of avoid that. But the point is, since I knew what each one of these streams were like, again, was it a small stream in a corn production area? Was it a bigger river in the north? I could weight each one of those sites to reflect how that sample site reflected on the overall population of streams in the state. So the point is that I could extrapolate to the entire population of streams in the state and have a pretty good understanding of what it means statewide, not just those 100 sites that I looked at. And you can see this next slide here, based on my estimates, using data from some laboratory toxicity studies showing that at certain concentrations, neonics are thought to be toxic to aquatic life. So I came up with this estimate, and I'll stand by these numbers, that upwards of 10,000 miles of streams in the state are impacted by neonics. So again, either a chronic effect where you have the insects, their growth is reduced, their behavior is impacted, or an acute effect where there's mortality fairly quickly being exposed to these chemicals. So the point is, the Sugar River is 91 miles long. The number of streams impacted in the state, based on my estimate, and I'm confident in it, is that we're talking about 111 sugar rivers across the state. So to me, that's a big number. So again, my focus was initially on neonics, but this other lab came up with estimates of these other chemicals. And you can see upwards of 25 different pesticides were found in these streams. And again, we're using data from Judah Branch and Sylvester Creek, which are in Greene County. So some local data for you guys to kind of think about. So it's not just neonics, but again, 21 other different compounds showed up in those particular streams. So we should be, if there's this general environmental concern we should have, but also I think most of you folks are on private wells. So those wells tend to be shallower in the aquifer than, say, some municipal well, that sort of thing. So it's not a stretch to think that those shallower wells are more likely to have exposure to pesticides than, say, some deep municipal well in, say, Madison, for example. So this is some data from the DATCAP, Department of Ag, Trade, Consumer Protection. So 800,000 private wells in the state. You can read here as well. They tested, I think it was 2024 data, or maybe 2023. But the point is they had 380 test sites across the state, seeing very high detection rates of pesticides in our private wells. Again, a lot of these chemicals aren't regulated by either the state government or federal government, and frankly, there's not a lot of information on what are the impacts of these chemicals. And again, you can, not the spooky guys or kind of show bad information, but I think you should be aware of this. Again, nitrates, as you all are aware, is a major concern, and a significant proportion of wells in Greene County have detectable concentrations of nitrates. So it's not just a pesticide issue, but some of these other chemicals as well. So just to quickly review again, neonics are widely used, again, the most widely used insecticide in Wisconsin, in the Midwest, globally, so a large use. Again, they're used prophylactically. Again, they're applied to the seeds, whether or not there's a known pest outbreak or not. You know, maybe that's a good insurance policy for use, folks, but it does come at a cost. Again, these things are fairly long-lived, so they can accumulate in the soil, and they're water-soluble, so they can move through the environment and end up where we don't want them. Again, if we could keep them on the landscape, in the plants, to control pests, that'd be great, but unfortunately that's not the case. And lastly, again, we're seeing, based on my understanding, the work I've done, that we're seeing concentrations of these chemicals at concentrations that are of concern as far as aquatic life is concerned. So, lastly, how much time do I have left, Tanya?
We're almost done. Like
Okay, 2 more slides, 3 more slides, quickly. So, I've worked for state government for 30 years now. I worked with the federal government on a number of different projects for many, many years. If you're thinking our state legislature or federal legislature is going to kind of take care of us on these issues, I would be willing to offer a different opinion on that. So my point is, and that's why I'm very happy to see you folks here today. Again, if we're relying on government to take corrective actions or improve the situation, I'm not confident. I'm much more confident seeing you folks in the audience. And last but not least, the environment's a very complex mechanism, and frankly, as humans, we know damn little about it. So the point is, you know, can we start losing some of these parts that keep the watch going, or whatever analogy you want to use? Again, at what point do we get to the stage where perhaps the wheels fall off or the clock stops working, that sort of thing? So I don't want to be a fear monger, but again, I think we should have a fair level of knowledge about this issue, and so you folks can make informed, intelligent decisions. So with that, I appreciate your time. Hopefully it was worth your time. Thank you.